All right. All right, can I go ahead and get started then?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kristin TePas, and I'm the Environmental Literacy and Workforce Development Coordinator for Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. And I'm co-hosting this natural resource career panel with my colleague, Megan Gunn, who is also with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. And just very briefly, for those of you that are not familiar with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, I just wanted to give a little background before we start. So we are a university-based, federally funded program through NOAA, so the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and we are jointly housed at the University of Illinois and Purdue University. And essentially, we fund research and conduct education and outreach on coastal issues in the Great Lakes, and in particular for Lake Michigan, since we are Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. Sea Grant is a national program, so we are only one of 34 programs across the country that do this type of work. So on to the reason why you all are here this morning. Part of our mission is workforce development, and a part of that is simply just generating awareness about careers in the environmental field and the variety of jobs that are out there. So today we have 5 professionals from various aspects of the natural resource field who have kindly agreed to speak to you with you all and to give you some insight into their various professions. So just of note, if you want to ask a question of any of our speakers, please go ahead and type it in the chat. And if it's for a particular speaker, just note their name so that we know who to direct the question to. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and let our panel members introduce themselves. So panel, please give your name, your organization, your job title, and then a little bit about what your job entails. And so I'll go ahead and we'll start with Paris, because you're first on my screen.
Okay. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Great. Hi, I'm Paris Collingsworth. I work with Purdue University in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And I also work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant with Kristin and Megan. My position, I actually have kind of 2 titles. One is an assistant research professor, and that's with Purdue and Forestry and Natural Resources. And then my position with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant is I am their Great Lakes ecosystem specialist. And so the responsibilities with both of those positions are really similar. Essentially what I do. So I'm a professor, but I don't have any like teaching responsibilities. I'm solely a research professor. So what I do is I try to go out and get grant money to do research projects. And I focus on applied research. So research about the Great Lakes that can be used in application to help manage the lakes. So there are a lot of different, sort of environmental concerns in the Great Lakes. And what I do is I work with a lot of the federal agencies that monitor the lakes, and I use their like EPA, USGS, and NOAA. And I help them use their monitoring program for applications that would help management. So just a real quick example, like hypoxia or low dissolved oxygen is a problem in the Great Lakes. So I help the EPA who monitors that hypoxia, I help them sort of use different methods to try to provide a better picture of what's going on under the water. So using different types of sensors and stuff, and help them develop that monitoring program so we can get a better idea of like how much hypoxia is out there, as an example. So yeah, that's hi.
Great. Thanks, Paris. Amanda, you're next on my list.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Hugelman. I work with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and I'm housed under the University of Illinois. So I'm based out of Chicago. I'm an aquatic invasive species outreach associate with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. And I do a lot of different things in my position, but the goal is to work to provide information on preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species. So those plants, animals, other organisms that should not necessarily be in an area that they have been transported to by human activity. And so we work with audiences like boaters, anglers, aquarium hobbyists, people who own water gardens, and other members of the public who interact with these aquatic ecosystems. And I help to adapt the best practices for preventing the spread of these invasive species, and to get them into the hands of these audiences. So this takes like social science work to figure out who these audiences are, what they need to know, and how they need to receive this information in the best way to promote behavior change. And it's social media work, it's giving presentation to different members of these audiences, and yeah, being sort of the go-between between the science and then what these groups need to know to to best utilize the resources that they like to enjoy.
Thanks, Amanda. Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Hulting. I work with US EPA Region 5. US EPA has 10 regions across the United States, of course, in addition to the headquarters office. So I am in Chicago, and our territory covers Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So the Great Lakes states minus the tiny bit of Pennsylvania and New York. I'm in the air division. I started out in the Great Lakes National Program Office doing air monitoring of persistent toxic pollutants like PCBs and some of the legacy pesticides like DDT, and then moved into the air division 15 years ago to work on climate change. A lot of that work was promoting voluntary reductions and actions from companies and facilities through EPA's partnership programs, the flagship one being the Energy Star program. So a lot of my more recent work has involved working with industrial facilities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions through changes in operations, and a lot of them are looking at electrification and renewables as well. 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, I became a manager. So I now have a staff of 14 folks who work on a broad range of programs, including climate change and energy efficiency, indoor air quality, and radon. We do some environmental justice work as well as it relates to air quality, and we also run the air toxics program, so reducing emissions of hazardous air pollutants through voluntary and regulatory means. So very different from being a staff person. You're driving people towards goals rather than doing some of the detailed work yourself, but we can get into that later. So US EPA Air Division, air quality and climate work.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, on to Mike.
Yeah, I'm Mike Mycroft. I'm a district wildlife biologist with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. I work out of our division of Fish and Wildlife, and I work primarily with private landowners to sort of explore ways of either establishing or enhancing habitat on behalf of different pollinator species, wildlife species, and also soil health and water quality. In addition to those duties, I also do some wildlife disease surveillance. So that involves, getting tissue samples and so forth from different species and getting them to the lab for analysis. And then I also do quite a bit of wildlife surveys to sort of monitor the status of different populations of specific species. And I spend a lot of time working with individuals, renters, homeowners, and things like that on issues having to do with wildlife conflicts. And I cover about 11 counties in the state. And so I spend quite a bit of time working on the phone with folks and helping them, deal with the raccoon in the attic or the the hawks chasing, after their chickens.
Thanks, Mike. I could have used your services. I had a robin's nest right above my deck, and they were dive bombing me while they were, the chicks hadn't fledged yet. Anthony, last but not least.
Hi, my name is Anthony Escobedo, he, him. I work at Dunes Learning Center as the Chief Naturalist here. I do primarily work in environmental education. So Dunes Learning Center is the education partner for the Indiana Dunes National Park. And we're a nonprofit organization that there are communities of kids, specifically like school groups, that will send their kids to this facility at the Indiana Dunes National Park, and we do their schooling for a field trip, for a 3-day field trip, and we do it outside. So pretty typically is like a history lesson for the day in a classroom would be reading history in a book. But what we do is we take that and kind of apply it to more tangible studies. So we'll do like first person reenactments to talk about the culture of Northwest Indiana, or, we'll do scientific data collection for their math lesson for the day. And we'll take that outside using, scientific instruments and things like that. So I do a lot of work specifically teaching kids. And then the other half of my job and why I'm the chief is because I also do some time inside of the office where we do hiring and recruiting for these positions, and then also communicating with teachers, and then curriculum development specifically is for the chief naturalist. So creating new programs, refreshing old programs, a lot of looking at evaluating our programs and how we can make them better and fit our audience more.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to Megan.
Thank you, Anthony. And I will go in the opposite direction. And we'll start with you, Anthony. What sparked your interest in going into this field?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I grew up in Northwest Indiana, and Megan and I grew up in the same area. And we, I don't know about her experience, but my experience was I didn't have much exposure to the outdoors. I just grew up most of my life not having access to that, or very limited access to that, especially considering that we had the national park in our backyard. But I didn't get involved into the outdoors until much later in life, until I was actually in college. And I started to explore, like, this was something that I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed going to the classes. I struggled in some of the subjects in life just growing up. And then when I started taking these classes and I was applying it to something that I was interested in, I studied fisheries at Purdue. So when I was looking at fisheries, I was like, wow, this math makes more sense when you talk about fish instead of something else that I don't really care about. And then when I started getting involved into that, I started noticing that had I had opportunities to the outdoors maybe earlier in life, I would have known that this was a passion of mine way before, so much later in life. And then I started exploring into like environmental education and being able to provide these opportunities for people in situations like mine, where maybe they don't know that these opportunities exist in an outdoor field, or making a career out of an outdoor profession. So I started kind of working my way into figuring out how to do environmental education, and kind of piloted some of the things at Purdue. And then it was like kind of by happenstance that I went to high school with somebody who worked at this organization, and their mom was like one of the cooks here, and kind of told me about the job. So it's kind of like strange to know that you grew up right in Northwest Indiana, right in the backyard, and didn't know this place existed. So that's how I got involved at this organization. And then from here, I just kind of moved my way throughout the ranks of the organization.
Thank you. Mike, what about you? What sparked your interest?
I would say just exposure. I grew up rurally in West Central Indiana and was an only child. So I found a lot of ways to entertain myself in the nearby woodlands. And we had a creek that I'd go exploring in and so forth. And eventually, around 7th grade, I think it was, I took an interest up in hunting and got with some friends, and we'd go out and hunt squirrels and rabbits, and and by the time I got into late high school, I naturally, I kind of thought, well, you know, I wonder if there's a way a guy can make a living doing this. So yeah, next thing you know, I'm at Purdue and graduating and ending up in the field of natural resources, working for Department of Natural Resources.
It sounds like there's a lot of Purdue grads in the room. Melissa, what about you? What sparked your interest in natural resources?
I grew up downstate Illinois, Peoria area, so not quite rural, kind of rural suburban. So I can relate to some of Mike's childhood experiences. We still had undeveloped forest around where I grew up as a kid. And so I went hiking in the woods a lot, in woods near my neighborhood. Thinking back, I have no idea who owned that property, but it was the 80s and people were just running around. So, and also my grandfather took my brother and I hiking at a great park in Peoria called the Forest Park Nature Center. It's along the Illinois River. If you ever make it to Peoria, you should go there. Beautiful views from the hills there. And so I did. Spending time outside was definitely part of what sparked my interest. I always loved math and science in school. And I think I wanted to be an architect when I was younger, because I liked houses and buildings, but then decided to be a biology major in college just because I thought the natural world was beautiful and interesting how everything worked. So I was a biology major, not knowing what I was going to do with it. Everyone else in my class was pre-med, it seemed. I was like the only non-pre-med person. You know, spoiler alert, you know, 90% of those folks did not become doctors. So I went to grad school at UNC Chapel Hill for environmental policy. I had done an internship with the Illinois EPA, their field office in Peoria, and went out on inspections and managed a database of landfill leachate data. Not that landfill leachate is that inspiring, but I liked going out on inspection. So I went to grad school. And then, you know, I temped for a while after grad school and did an internship with the Great Lakes National Program Office and eventually got hired. And then got hired by the EPA. And within EPA, there are lots of different opportunities and programs, and that's what's cool about working there. We are still hiring a lot of people, so if anyone on this call is in a position to apply, register with usajobs.gov and set up a profile to get job listings. So really my first job, I related to what Anthony said about happenstance. I mean, one of my pieces of advice is to be open-minded about what kind of positions you're open to. I thought I was going to be like Mike and be doing field work and being outside all the time. And I've ended up being a desk jockey, and that's okay too. Though in the Great Lakes office, I did some sampling and lab work on the ship. So I think I've just been open to opportunities as they pop up. And climate change is also not something that was in my grand plan at age 20 or 22, but the opportunity popped up and it seemed like an interesting thing to take on and learn more about. So that's it, I guess. I could go on, but I'm not going to.
Thank you. Amanda, what sparked your interest?
Yeah, so I was one of those pre-med majors who didn't become a doctor. I had family in medicine and went to school thinking that's what I would do as well, despite having grown up camping and being outdoors and working summer camps. And then my sophomore year at Loyola in Chicago, I realized pre-med was not working. But I'd really gravitated towards the environmental science classes that we had to take as undergrads, and switched my major thinking, all right, I'm just going to go with this and we'll see what happens. And yeah, ended up really loving the work and studying how things worked around us. And with my kind of background with summer camps and working with youth and people who are really experiencing this for the first time, I started thinking that that's something that I would like to go into. And I had a professor who I still work with now in my team, and he sort of introduced me to this position in this organization, and made the connection there. So also kind of happenstance. Yeah, just keeping those connections with the people who are doing the work that you think is interesting. Yeah, being involved in those spaces and still continuing to spend time on site is sort of what led me here.
And Paris, was research always the end goal, or what sparked your interest?
Yeah, so my story is going to kind of be an amalgamation of what everybody else just said, but I actually can like kind of trace it back to a really early memory. So I'm from a really rural area in Ohio, northwestern Ohio, and in the 1980s, my dad, like many around him, lost his job, and he spent the entire summer. One year when I was young, he would wake me up every morning and take me fishing. He's just because I think he just needed to occupy his time. And so he had much more patience with it than I did. And so we didn't have a boat or anything. And we would just be at this pond and he would fish for hours longer than I wanted to. So I would just start walking around and looking at what was going on in the water. And I started noticing like, well, these fish are only found in this place, and like these plants only exist here. I was like, this is really cool. I wonder what's going on. So that's like the memory that sort of crystallized that. But then further on, like, you know, fast forwarding, I was like first generation to go to college in my family. So didn't really have much of an idea. I knew I was good at science. But the only people that I knew in my community who did anything related to science were like doctors, and I don't like blood, so that was out of the question. So I was actually pre-pharmacy, just because that's sciencey, right? And so went into that, and like most pre-pharmacy kind of people, once I got to organic chemistry, I was like, this is garbage. So I'm out of here. So I started doing biology, and then at one point my professors noticed like that I had an aptitude for it, I guess, and just kind of pulled me aside and were like, what are you going to do? And I was like, I have no idea. And they said, well, you should do what we do. You should like get into doing research. So I was like, okay, that sounds great. So my first job after getting my biology degree was actually in a molecular genetics lab. Because there's a lot of that available where I was, and this was in Birmingham, Alabama. And I did that for a while and was offered a PhD position in a pretty good lab there. But I just always wanted to get back to like doing stuff in aquatic ecology. And so that early memory of like being, you know, around those ponds and like what's going on under the water was always fascinating to me. So I decided my next step would be, I'm going to go to grad school. I want to do aquatic ecology, but I want to do something that like, if I don't like it, if I just want to get a master's, I can stop there. So I got into fisheries because you can get jobs like Mike does with a master's degree as a terminal degree. And I actually got a chance to do my thesis for my master's degree was about different patches of vegetation and like the different fish that occupy it. Like, so I basically thought of like my master's thesis when I was about 10 years old. So that was really cool to be able to do that. And then the next step was just like, okay, like now I want to start working on like the Great Lakes just because of my appreciation for them as like a natural resources. So I want to take whatever skills I have and try to help with what's going on in the Great Lakes. And that's been the direction I've been on since that would have been like went on for a PhD and postdoc and in my current positions.
Thanks, Paris. Kind of adding to what Paris mentioned. So we talked about going into grad school. I guess I'm opening this question up for any of the panel. this was one that came up in the chat. So for anyone who went to grad school, how did they determine if that was the right fit for their future? You know, why did they decide to go? And do you feel like grad school is expected in your field?
I can weigh in on that. You know, I was a biology major. I didn't take a lot of environmental science classes in undergrad. Environmental policy. Environmental policy is very interdisciplinary. It's social science, it's physical science, it's life science, it's policy, it's environmental law. So I felt like I needed more schooling. And a master's degree, it's 2 years. It's not that heavy of a lift. So I really enjoyed grad school. I'd say most of the folks we hire, where, you know, in the air division do have master's degrees, but not all. My most recent hire, who came on board a few weeks ago, has an environmental engineering degree and no grad school, but he has 10 years of environmental consulting. So that is the equivalent or beyond a master's degree just from work experience. So I don't think it's necessary. I think it's good to have. It's good to have kind of that extra coursework and that extra exposure, but at least at EPA, we don't necessarily require it. And I think no matter what job you end up in, you learn most of the rules and the guidance and the job on the job. So, but my advice is always to get a solid background in the pure sciences, physical science, life science, because that stuff is harder to learn later on. The policy and the ins and outs of the job, you can learn on the job.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to respond to that question? And I'll repeat it. How did you determine if grad school was the right fit for you? Why did you decide to go? And whether or not grad school is expected in your field?
I will say that a lot of people, we do have a fair number of people who might work at EPA for a little while and then they go back to grad school. So that's a lot of people don't go right away necessarily. I did, but I actually think it's kind of good to work a little bit because I feel like the people who worked before grad school had a better idea of what they wanted to do with their grad degree.
Yeah, that was just kind of the comment that I was going to make is, you know, so to be a professor, yeah, you need to have a PhD and probably some postdoc experience, which is a postdoc is like a residency for a doctor. Like you just go and you don't get paid enough money to go do some additional stuff. But so I actually bring in grad students and to my program, and they do research underneath my direction. But when I talk to grad students, I definitely tell them the higher up you go, the more like certain you need to be that this is the right place. Because especially like a PhD it's a long and difficult process. And if you're not 100% committed to what you want to do and have a good like idea of where you want to be at the end of it, I would say just don't do it. Because it's not, you're going to be spending a lot of time and it's going to be really frustrating. And, you know, as Melissa said, like a lot of these things, if you can get work experience, like that looks really good on your resume, like coming out. So if you want to go back to grad school afterwards, the hard thing is getting your foot in the door. And that's, you know, that's about who you know and sort of what your connections are.
I just want to touch on the other half because I didn't go to grad school, and a lot of the people that we hire haven't gone to grad school and are recent graduates, and our program is specifically just kind of set up for people to get that experience like you were talking about, to kind of get their feet wet into the field and see if that this is something that they want to or could find a more specified interest. And some of our interns have gone back to grad school and some have gone on to other jobs and more professional jobs. So yeah, I think everything that everyone was saying is kind of aligns kind of right along with that.
All right, anyone else before we move on to the next question? Okay. Megan, do you want to?
Yeah, so this is another question from the chat, and it says it may be more oriented towards Mike and Melissa, but anybody can answer. But the question is, when you're working with people or companies that have different environmental ideas or are less conscious about environmental conservation, how have you been able to form positive relationships or functioning relationships to reach agreements? In a nutshell, how do you work with the people that have opposite ideals than you?
You want to go first, Mike? I bet you have juicier stories than I do.
Actually, probably not, because the majority of the folks that I deal with have sought me out to benefit wildlife or habitat or soil and water quality. I don't work in the regulatory area of our outfit. So those folks, I'm sure, would line up perfectly with this question, but I'm very fortunate in that I'm more of a voluntary contact.
I guess I'm in a similar situation in that I'm working with a lot of the good actors. That being said, especially in the industrial energy efficiency world, a lot of it is cost reduction. A lot of manufacturing facilities have very high energy costs, and it's the primary motivation might be costs. That being said, I've seen a huge shift in how the private sector looks at this in the past 15 years. I feel like there's so much more expected of companies in terms of their environmental posturing and reducing their carbon footprint, and feel like there's more appetite for this now in the private sector than there was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it was just like you had the leaders going out and doing this, and now you have, I mean, one of the companies I've worked with is Marathon Petroleum, and no one thinks of them as being like these environmental leaders, but they have like a top-notch energy management program because refining is a huge energy user, and they see the writing on the wall with eventually carbon regulation, though that anybody following the news knows what a long saga that's been. But I'm really impressed with the private sector and the work they're doing. 10 years ago, if you would have told me that really states and the private sector was going to drive so much of the progress in this, and the feds would be kind of out of the picture in some ways, I wouldn't have believed it. So, but with individual, I remember working at the Minnesota State Fair and volunteering at their Eco Experience booth and talking to some folks who really didn't believe in climate change. The thing is, everybody likes energy efficiency. A lot of work on climate is reducing waste. You're not wasting energy, you're not wasting materials, you're not wasting water. And so I think kind of that idea of thrift and not wasting things can appeal to a broader audience. And when you talk about the solutions to climate, renewables, and energy efficiency, a lot of people like that. So sometimes it's a little puzzling to me. It's like you talk to them about climate and they're like, oh, but then you talk to them about the things that we would do to solve the problem, and they're like, oh, sure. So I think you got to meet people where they're at, just with everything else, and find out what they care about. And I think it's easy to frame it once you know what they care about.
Thanks. So we have a question regarding skills. So this would be for anyone. So what skills would you say you need or are most useful for the environmental conservation field? And this is from a current grad student looking to maximize their time and courses. And I would say hard and soft skills, to consider.
I guess I can jump in here since it's a graduate student question. So in my experience, and certainly, this is, sort of shaded by what I do, but statistical skills are things that like never are always useful. A lot of people shy away from it because they don't like the math, I guess, side of things, but it's always a useful tool to have. Like, and I'm talking about in terms of your ability to find a job after school, because that's probably why you're in grad school. The other thing is, and this one is sort of the opposite end of it, but like writing and communication. If you're have a lot of experience getting up in front of people and speaking, which you should be trying to do that while you're in grad school. A lot of people don't like doing that either. They don't like getting up and talking in front of people, but that's what you're going to do in your job down the road. You're going to need to science that's not communicated just doesn't really like exist. It's just an idea. So you have to be able to communicate it. You have to be able to speak to the public, but you also have to be able, in my experience, like kind of my currency is writing papers. And so when I bring new grad students in, you're kind of holding your breath when you get that first text from them, because like, are they going to be a good writer, or am I going to have to spend like all my time editing their stuff, or are they like a good communicator and can write well? So I think those are just things that are always useful, and useful kind of across the board. Maybe the statistics are less, but that's very specific to what I do, but certainly being able to analyze data, being able to communicate are important pieces.
I would second writing and communication, especially in my work sort of engaging with the public. You need to be comfortable starting conversations with people who might not be necessarily the most excited to talk with you as well. And also my position is grant funded, and I'm working on multiple projects at once, and it's time management and being able to prioritize the things that need to be done sooner than later. And one of the, I would say the most important things that I learned, I don't have a graduate degree, but in my undergrad education, I had a professor who really taught me how to learn, if that makes sense, and how to ask the right questions and know the people that will work best with you. And yeah, I think a skill in like making those connections and being comfortable just asking for help when you need it has been useful for me.
A specific thing I would add, I mean, the communication and writing is very important. We do writing, we do writing samples when we do interviews, and they're often the thing that makes or breaks someone. They might have a good interview, and if the writing samples are short, we give people 24 hours to respond to a prompt, and there's length limits. And it has to be written in plain language, but someone can be out of contention if they don't have good writing. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have 14 staff. It's too many people, to be frank, and I don't have time to edit other people's stuff. They gotta be able to write and communicate succinctly and well. So agree wholeheartedly. You got to be able to present and talk to people, especially if you're trying to convince people to voluntarily take action to reduce their carbon footprint or their pollution. A more specific thing is data analysis and visualization. A lot of we're entering the land of air quality sensors, and there's water quality sensors, and a lot of like automated monitoring tools, and that generate huge amounts of data. And we need people who are able to use Python and R and click tools and all of the kind of software and programming techniques that are out there to analyze that data and visualize it so it can be presented to like simple managers like me in order to make decisions. So if there are courses on data analysis and visualization, that's kind of in the same bucket as Paris's comment about stats, but I think that's becoming more and more. I mean, we live in a world of data being generated, so much data being generated, we need to make heads or tails out of it.
Thanks. And anyone else on skills that are useful for your job? All right.
Several of you mentioned that the reason that you got to where you are because of connections that you made, or because of somebody saw something in you before you made that connection and they pulled you to the side. Can any of you give advice on how to make those connections for those that are a little bit more shy and not putting themselves out there?
Conferences can be good. A lot of conferences offer like free registration or very reduced registration for students. And if you can look at what conferences might be available in your field. It is hard. It takes extroversion. There are happy hours at conferences, and sometimes it takes a beer. I'm extroverted, but still, like if you're in a room with all strangers, you have to be kind of ballsy to go up to somebody. But that being said, if you go into a session, try to make a point to ask a question, because then a lot of times people will come up to you after the presentation and say, I had the same question, and you'll get into a discussion about it. So, speaking up and asking questions during sessions. And some conferences do have like facilitated networking sessions now. And those can be helpful if you're less extroverted. It's hard. I think it's hard for everybody to do that sort of networking. Informational interviews are low stakes. You can always ask folks for informational interviews too, if they're working in a field you think is interesting.
I can possibly offer some advice from an introvert. I would have loved to have been able to have done the things that Melissa mentioned, but I just never quite had it in my nature. So what I did is I identified certain professors who were teaching topics that I was really interested in. And then later when I started working intermittently or as a seasonal worker in my department as a naturalist, I got to know some of the ecologists and things like that. And I just kind of one-on-one, give them a call about, some wildflower that I found that I thought was a little bit out of its range or something like that. And I tell you, that really, really helped because like I said, a lot of that conferencing and so forth, just it wasn't for me. So if there's anybody similar to that, you can take more of a one-on-one approach to it. You got to get over that initial hurdle of picking up the phone or dropping by somebody's office.
All right.
I just real quick, I did want to make sure everyone had a chance. But sort of to what Mike was just saying, I can say this as a professor, we have, when you teach a class, you have office hours and no one shows up to office hours. And so you have that time. And so I understand that maybe it would be, a bit intimidating, but to use it, that's your time when you can actually have like one-on-one conversations. And most of the people that I know would be thrilled if someone came in and wanted to talk, not necessarily about like, I have this problem in your class. It's just like, I'm interested in this field. Like, how do I get started? Like, that would blow my mind if somebody did that in office hours, and I would love to talk to them about it. So
I just kind of want to add on to that. I think it's equally important to initiate that kind of relationship, but also maintaining that relationship throughout time, because although an opportunity might arise in one case, you don't know what might happen later down the road. So important to initiate a relationship, but then also maintaining those relationships, I feel are equally as important as well.
All right, thank you, everyone. So another question that's come in is, what has been the most rewarding and challenging part of your job?
One of the challenges in my position at least, is that we kind of do slow work. Behavior change takes a long time, and it can be a bit discouraging when you're not seeing these immediate results from the work that you do. And that's been a challenge to kind of reframe and sort of recognize the little wins of the days. But the reward comes from seeing that, and when you're wrapping up a project and you're looking back on the things that you actually did and realizing how many people I talked to in a summer, or when I have created a brochure and it's in my hand and I can see the tangible result of my work. Those are all good feelings.
I think for state or federal work, one of the challenges is when different administrations come in. And so every 4 to 8 years, we get a new president who comes in and has different priorities. And you have to adapt to that. And you have to figure out how your work fits in with those new priorities. And sometimes your work might change quite a bit and you kind of have to roll with it. Or, you know, during the Trump administration, I was still doing climate work. But that's when I really started focusing on industrial energy efficiency, because I figured no one would tell me to not help manufacturers be more efficient. That's really hard sometimes, but it also can kind of inspire new ways of thinking as well. I mean, environmental justice is a huge priority of this administration, and it's required us to take a deeper look at how we do things and how we target our work, and that's been cool to see.
I would say in my job, the most challenging and the most rewarding things are my sort of like mentoring and interacting with grad students. So I bring in students and sort of hand them off a project and they get to work on it. And it's challenging because every one of them is different and you've got to figure out like what motivates people, and it's just a relationship that you build over time and you figure out how they work. And not all of them work in the same way I do, you know, so so that's a bit challenging, but it's also like super rewarding to see them finish up. And like usually every time that I've been able to do this, and I haven't been doing it a real long time, but usually people sort of come into their own at the end of grad school, and by then they've sort of identified where they want to go. And I'm really proud to say that like all of my students, I've had 4 master's students graduate and 1 postdoc, and all of them are like working in this field and working in the Great Lakes, basically helping to promote the health of the Great Lakes. So that's exactly what I want to be doing.
And I will piggyback off of your answer. And for the rest of the panelists, do you believe that our field of work has gained more coverage and interest with younger people? And are you seeing more growth in the field?
I'll start with just like the youngest. I work probably with the youngest group of people on this panel, but like, I mean, from as young as like 6 years old, I think that there has been more interest about being environmentally conscious. I don't think the 5-year-olds would call it that, but they like nature and animals and things like that. So, and then all the way up to like, you know, the teenagers that I work with, 17, even up until the, you know, the 18 that work for me and things like that. I definitely think that there is more awareness about human impact and how we can be more conscious about that.
I think definitely there's been more interest, and one trend I have noticed in the past 20 years is greater diversity in the folks who are working in the environmental field. It was, I mean, mostly, I think my grad cohort was mostly white people, And now more and more of our new hires are people of color, and that is something that's really important. And I love to see that that's changing. On the energy side of things, those conferences, when I started going to industrial energy efficiency conferences, that was dudes, so many dudes. And just the shift between the same conference in 2 years and 4 years, a lot more women and people of color going into energy engineering and that sort of thing. So I'm just seeing the field overall become more diverse, which is great.
All right, we have a couple related questions that deal with this field is so broad, and so any advice on choosing a specialization if you have interest in a lot of areas?
Oh man, be open. I mean, I don't know how others feel. I mean, a lot of it, part of your career is driving towards what you want, and part of your career is luck, to be quite frank. So I would, make sure you have the right coursework in terms, if you want to drive towards something specific, target your networking in those areas and target your coursework in those areas. But I think I always tell people, have an open mind. Who was it that hated organic chemistry? Paris? Was it Paris? I also hated organic chemistry.
I think everybody does.
Organic chemistry was terrible. I had it at 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which is sadistic and wrong. And my first job at EPA was monitoring organic chemicals. And I hung out with analytical chemists all the time. And so the joke was on me, and I had to use the organic chemistry, but it was still a great experience. So I think you can, again, target your coursework and your networking and places you want to go to be open to other possibilities.
So I can't hate on organic chemistry too much because it's actually where I met my wife. We were lab partners in organic chemistry. So, in terms of like what I tell my students, and again, this is like for grad students and people like thinking about like careers like in academics or things like that, there's like a couple different ways to think about it. And you can make a career out of, like, if you're really fall in love with like some technique, like people who are like geneticists, they just really like the techniques of like solving these problems with genetics. I'm more of like a broadly trained ecologist. So I think more about the ecosystem, and then I can use genetics to like answer some questions, but that's not like what I focus on. So I guess it's like a couple of different ways to think about it. But if you're going to do this more broad thing, again, it's more about like data analysis. And also the things, when I say statistics, I'm also talking about, the working with big data sets and all that, because that's just the way things are going to go in the future. It's not going to stop. So like coding and understanding how to manipulate large data sets, like that's just always a tool that's always going to be useful down the road.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Kristin.
Oh, no, I was just going to say if there was anyone else, but go ahead, Megan.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. We are closing in at the end of our virtual panel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for taking time out of your day to talk to all of the people on the call today. And this is recorded and we will share it via email afterwards, and it'll live on our Sea Grant YouTube page, our Illinois Indiana Sea Grant YouTube page. But if there is, panelists, one piece of advice that you would give to students that are interested in working in the environmental field, what would that be?
Never give up hope. There are, in my experience and some folks I know, there are days you probably just want to shake your head and wonder, where did I go wrong? Why am I not doing this? Or why did I not choose a different path? But I would say that there are far more days where you look back and you're like, Okay, this was the right way. So just become the perpetual optimist, I guess.
Learn how to, we already talked about it, but learn how to write and communicate orally. Practice giving presentations. I took a business and technical writing course in college, and I think that was helpful. Your fellow, your boss and your fellow employees will appreciate it if you can communicate succinctly and effectively.
And I would also, it's already been said too, but I would also say start building your networks as soon as you can. It's been said, during this panel, a lot of it's kind of luck, but a lot of it's like just who you know. And I've definitely benefited from building like strong networks. So I have a lot of different people that I could call on if I need someone to like write me a letter for a position or something like that. So just start as early as you can.
Yeah, it is a big field, but there are so many things that you can go into, and so I would say just follow the things that feel good to you and that you have an interest in, and that's how you're going to end up doing something that is enjoyable.
I'll kind of just wrap up and say, give 100% in what you're doing. I think that sets you apart from other people and makes you motivated in the work that you do, is when you give 100% into your work.
Awesome. Thank you all. I have one more piece. If you're interested in contacting our panelists, here are their contact information. Feel free to screenshot it and reach out to them if you have any burning questions that you weren't able to ask today. And thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, specialists. You guys are great.
Everybody.
Thank you. It was
Thank
fun.
you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.